You know that feeling when you're in a conversation, a good one with people you genuinely like, and somewhere around the third or fourth exchange, you just check out? Not because you're bored of them, not because you're tired, but because your brain has already run the entire conversation forward, anticipated where it's going, processed the three most likely responses they'll give, and it just moved on without you. And you're sitting there nodding, smiling, saying the right things, while some part of you is three rooms away thinking about something completely unrelated. And the strangest part, you feel guilty about it, like something is wrong with you. If that hit a nerve, here's what nobody tells you, right? That's not a social problem. That's not rudeness. And it's almost certainly not something that therapy is going to fix. Because what you're actually describing is a cognitive pattern that is deeply, almost architecturally, built into people who have spent their whole lives thinking faster than the world around them moves. And the truly uncomfortable part, most of those people have no idea that's what's happening. They just think they're weird. Hey, I'm Martin. If this kind of inside the brain stuff is your thing, hit subscribe. New videos every week. Now, let's get into it. Here's what pop psychology and, honestly, most gifted education programs completely get wrong about high IQ. They treat it like a superpower, like it's just intelligence turned up. You think faster, learn easier, score higher. Life on easy mode. And on the surface, some of that is true. But dig even slightly below the surface, and you find something nobody is putting on inspirational posters. Because the same cognitive machinery that makes extremely high intelligence possible also makes ordinary life genuinely, structurally harder. Not as a side effect, as a direct consequence of the same wiring. And most people with very high IQs spend decades, sometimes their whole lives, not understanding why. Let's start with what this actually looks like. From the outside, someone with an extremely high IQ often looks like one of two things. Either the effortlessly capable person who seems to get everything without trying, or, and this one's more common than people realize, the underperformer. The person who was called gifted as a kid and then somehow just didn't live up to it, distracted, scattered, perpetually bored in environments that reward compliance more than thinking. The kid who read every book except the assigned one. But from the inside, it feels like living in a slightly different time signature than everyone else. Information arrives faster. Patterns click into place before other people have finished describing the problem. Conversations can feel simultaneously overstimulating and understimulating. Too much noise, not enough signal. And underneath all of that, often a persistent, low-grade sense of not quite fitting. Not in a dramatic way, just a kind of ambient friction with the world that's hard to name and even harder to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. And here's where it gets really interesting, Mike, because that friction isn't random. It has a mechanism. What's actually happening at a basic level is something researchers call hyperconnectivity. Brains in the extremely high IQ range. We're talking roughly 145 and above, what's sometimes referred to as the profoundly gifted range. Don't just process information faster. They process more of it simultaneously, and they make more cross-domain connections doing it. Neuroscientists at the University of New Mexico, including Rex Jung and Richard Heyer, have spent years studying this through neuroimaging. And what they found is that high intelligence isn't primarily about one area of the brain being bigger or faster. It's about how efficiently different regions talk to each other. More white matter integrity, more cross-network communication. The clinical term for this is neural efficiency, and it sounds elegant until you realize what it actually means to live inside it. Think about what that actually means for a second. Your brain is constantly running more threads than the average human nervous system. It's pulling in more information, making more connections, identifying more patterns, and it's doing all of that automatically without your conscious permission. You're not choosing it to overthink. Your brain is doing it the way a high-end processor runs background tasks. You don't turn it off, it just runs. And here's why the brain developed this way. Because it's worth understanding that this isn't a quirk or an accident. Cognitively complex environments throughout evolutionary history rewarded individuals who could model more variables, anticipate more outcomes, detect more patterns in ambiguous information. The human brain optimized for that. Very high intelligence is essentially that optimization taken to an extreme. The problem is that evolution didn't account for fluorescent lit classrooms, 40-hour work weeks, or small talk at office parties. The hardware is running software that was built for a different environment. That's not a personality flaw. That's a nervous system response to a world it wasn't quite designed for. But here's the part that actually costs people something. Because hyperconnectivity sounds great on paper. And for certain tasks, creative synthesis, abstract problem solving, pattern recognition, it genuinely is. But there's a cost that almost nobody talks about. And it shows up in a few specific ways. The first is what psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski called psychic overexcitability, a term that sounds more dramatic than he intended, but what it describes is real. Extremely gifted individuals don't just think more intensely, they feel more intensely, perceive more intensely, and are stimulated more intensely by inputs that most people barely register. A piece of music isn't just pleasant, it's almost unbearably moving. A moral injustice isn't an abstract problem. It lands like a physical weight. Dabrowski spent decades studying gifted populations and found that this heightened intensity across emotional, sensory, and intellectual domains was one of the most consistent features of the extremely gifted. It's not dramatic, it's not performance, it's just more signal coming through the same set of wires. The second cost is what researchers have called the threshold effect in social cognition. A landmark study by Lian Gabora and Apararanjan found something counterintuitive about very high IQ. At a certain point, intelligence stops predicting social ease and starts working against it. Because the more cross-domain connections your brain makes automatically, the harder it becomes to track which of those connections will be legible to someone else. You've arrived at an insight through 7 associative leaps your brain made in under a second. Explaining that to someone who made 2 of those leaps in real time, while also tracking the emotional tone of the conversation and the 3 other things your brain is simultaneously doing, that's genuinely hard. And over time, people often stop trying. They simplify. They perform being less than they are. And that performance becomes its own kind of exhaustion. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people with very high IQs mistake this exhaustion for their personality. They've spent so long adapting, shrinking, simplifying, translating themselves for the room, that they genuinely don't know where the adaptation ends and they begin. The aloofness that other people notice, often a protective pattern that started in childhood when being too much caused friction. The perfectionism, frequently a response to being the person in the room who can already see every flaw in the plan, which means completing something always feels like deciding which imperfections to live with. The self-deprecating humor, usually someone who learned very early that intelligence made people uncomfortable, so they started taking it off the table before anyone else could. And that last one, learning as a child that you needed to make yourself smaller, easier, less. That's a pattern I've covered in a lot of depth in another video on this channel. It's called The Psychology of a Child Who Grew Up Too Fast. And if any of this is resonating, that video is going to hit even harder, because a lot of extremely high IQ people didn't just grow up gifted. They grew up having to manage themselves in rooms that couldn't quite hold them. I'll link it right here. Watch it after this one. Okay? Back to it. This is the part most people miss entirely. It's not that extremely high IQ people lack self-awareness. It's that they've developed so much self-editing, so much strategic self-presentation, that the awareness itself has become a kind of trap. You can see yourself performing the simplified version so clearly that you start to wonder if the simplified version is actually you. So, what do most people try to do about this? They try to think their way out of it. And look, if thinking were going to fix this, it would have fixed it already. Because the people we're talking about are, by definition, very good at thinking. They've already analyzed the problem from 12 angles. They've already read the research. They've already identified the pattern. And the pattern continues anyway, trying to reason a nervous system response into submission is like trying to argue with a fire alarm. Your brain doesn't care that you know it's probably not a drill. The emotional and physiological response happens upstream of your conscious reasoning. That's not a logic problem. That's a wiring problem. What actually works, and this is supported by the work of clinical psychologists like Gail Post, who has spent years working specifically with gifted adults, is two things. First, context. Not therapy in the generic sense, but finding or creating environments where the full range of your processing isn't a liability. This sounds obvious, but most people have never actually experienced it in adulthood because they've spent so long adapting that they've never tested what happens when they stop. The research on this is consistent. Gifted adults who find what Post calls intellectual peers, not people with the same test scores, but people who can genuinely track and match their associative speed, show measurable improvements in sustained well-being, and reduce social exhaustion. Not because the relationships are perfect, but because the performance cost drops. Second, and this is the one that surprises people, boredom tolerance, not stimulation. The intuitive move for a brain that craves input is to add more input, more projects, more learning, more complexity. But what actually regulates a hyper-connected nervous system isn't more signal. It's learning to sit in low stimulation states without interpreting them as problems to be solved. Mindfulness research at Harvard, particularly the work coming out of Sarah Lazar's lab on cortical changes in long-term meditators, suggests that the ability to tolerate cognitive stillness is a trainable skill. And for high IQ individuals, It functions almost like a pressure valve. The goal isn't to slow your brain down. It's to stop treating its natural resting state as a malfunction. Here's the thing, and I want you to sit with this for a second. The story most people with very high intelligence have been told, implicitly or explicitly, is that the hard parts are a trade-off. The price of admission for the good parts. The loneliness, the overstimulation, the chronic sense of not quite fitting background noise you learn to live with. But that's not actually what the research says. What the research says is that those aren't inevitable features of intelligence. They're artifacts of navigating a world that wasn't built with your cognitive architecture in mind, which means they're not permanent. They're not you. Your brain isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was trained to do in exactly the environment it was given. The question worth asking, maybe for the first time, isn't, what's wrong with me? It's, what would change if I stopped explaining yourself down to a size that fits? That's worth thinking about.